The SS Adela was built in 1878 in Glasgow. At the time it was the height of innovation. It was 200 foot long and had been kitted out to carry cargo, livestock and passengers, and it would have been a very popular vessel on the Dublin to Liverpool route for the next 40 years until the tragic events of 1917 when it was sunk. The ship was built for Robert Tedcastle. Robert Tedcastle had been born in Scotland in 1825 and had moved to Dublin to work with his uncle, who was a very successful coal merchant. Now, Robert obviously had a very shrewd business mind, because as the years went on, his uncle had gone back to Scotland, but he built up a very sizable fleet and had moved into Dublin-Liverpool cargo trade. In 1897 then, they went into partnership with McCormack's Coal Merchants, and that would have been the birth of the famous Tedcastle McCormack Company, which would have been well known in the Dublin Docklands area. Robert was a very successful businessman, so successful in fact that the family home in Dublin was at Marley Park, and what we now know as Marley Park was the family estate, which was quite sizable. Robert died in 1919, and shortly after his death, Tedcastle and McCormack's was incorporated into the British and Irish Steam Packet Company. At that time, the British and Irish Steam Packet Company had been buying up a lot of the companies around Dublin and amalgamating them into one big unit. One of the important things about the loss of the SS Adela was the impact it would have had, not just on Dublin, but in particular on the Dublin Dockland communities. We would have seen 2 weeks earlier, on the 14th of December, the sinking of the SS Hare with the loss of 12 of its crew. And then we saw on the 27th of December the sinking of the SS Adela with all of its crew except for the captain, 24 people. Now, out of those two ships, half of the casualties came from the close-knit and reasonably small Dublin Dockland communities. Now, this is really significant for a number of reasons. Again, you had a small community. You would have had the people working on the ships, would have known most of the other people working in the docks. They would have known the dock labourers, the carters, the warehouse men, etc. So when people died, everybody would have known them. Again, in the seafaring trade, if you look at the records, you'll see a lot of people would have served on a number of different ships, and they would have served with different people. Some of the people who died on the Adela had been on the Hare in the past. Some people on the Hare had probably been on the Adela in the past. So again, really what I'm trying to say is everybody knew everybody. And then there would be the very close family links. When people were working together, they would socialise together and meet each other in the community. So you would have had people who had married into each other's families and were related in different ways. So the loss of 24 people is significant for each individual family, but the impact on a workforce and a community is enormous. And one newspaper report at the time said out of those two ships, the SS Hare and the SS Adela, there was 100 dependents left behind. So you have to realise, in a small part of Dublin, you had John Mackey and Francis Mangan were brother-in-laws. So they would have had children they left behind, they would have had a large number of dependents. William Barry and George Jones were an uncle and nephew. And even after the tragedy, the family of Christopher Wolfe, who died, and the family of James Farrell, who died, members of those families married into each other. So when you talk about the scale of death, you might think that 12 families in the Docklands, it's bad enough that they died, but when you realise how closely connected they all are, the impact that they would have on the families, the impact they would have on the kids, the impacts they would have on the widows, and in many cases people would live with their grannies and their grandparents would be living in the house, they'd be looking after them. And in one case we know there was a disabled brother who was living with one of the families. So when you think of the scale of tragedy, it really goes beyond 12 deaths on their immediate families. It's a huge amount and it's a huge impact on the community. So after many years of sailing the Liverpool to Dublin, Dublin to Liverpool route, the Adela would meet a very tragic end on the 27th of December 1917. Just 2 weeks earlier, the SS Hare had been sunk on the 14th of December. The SS Hare was making its way from England into Dublin when it was hit by German torpedoes and was sunk and lost about half of its crew, many of them from the Docklands area. This would have been very fresh in the minds of the crew of the SS Adela as they set out on the 27th of December. Just after Christmas, family's probably still in the festive spirit, and we know one of the crew members was celebrating his birthday that day. It set out from Dublin just after 5 o'clock. At that time, there was a system in place. They were aware of the threat of U-boats, so you could be held up for a day or two, you could be held up for a few hours until you got Admiralty clearance and allowed to sail. The SS Adela set out just after 5, and we don't know a lot about what went on the ship that day. The ship's log has never been found, but we do know at approximately 10 to 12, as it was approaching the Skerries, Anglesey, just off Holyhead, it was struck by a German torpedo. There would have been panic aboard. The ship almost broke in two and started to sink immediately. The lifeboats crashed onto the deck. Some of them are damaged, but luckily one of them landed in the water safely. A number of people, including Captain Michael Tyrrell, managed to scramble into that lifeboat. I think 4 of them got in originally, and they managed to pull another 3 men out of the water. There's a total of 7 of them in that lifeboat, which was damaged, filling with water, and they had to spend a few hours. They'd no oars. They had to spend a few hours drifting, trying to bail out that boat so it wouldn't go under. Again, it's hard to imagine the panic they were in. The ship was carrying livestock, so when it went down, we know the livestock were in the water. They would have been thrashing about frantically trying to swim, and they would have been drowning around the men. A terrible sight. On top of the panic, the risk to their own lives, there would have been the horrible sounds of maybe other men calling out, the noise of the ship sinking, and the animals thrashing around. The only survivor also recalled that in the distance he did spot the U-boat on the surface, having a look at the damage they had done before turning and sailing away. The men in the lifeboat faced a terrible ordeal. It was pitch black, it was freezing, they would have been soaked, and the lifeboat was rapidly filling with water that they had to constantly bail. The water was choppy and a number of men were washed overboard. Eventually it came to shore near Holyhead. Of all the men who managed to stay on board, only one would survive, and that was Captain Michael Tyrrell. According to the family of Samuel Burrows, we've no record of this, but according to family law, Samuel did survive for a very short time when they were taken ashore, but would die afterwards. The sole survivor, Captain Tyrrell, he did speak at an inquest on the loss of the ship, and I'll just read what he said about the crew. It's quite significant. He said, "All discharged of their duties faithfully and well." And at the inquest, he broke down giving evidence, and apparently the coroner broke down. It was so emotional hearing the evidence. But one of the reports afterwards in the Irish Independent described Captain Tyrrell and said he survived because he was a man of powerful physique. He had been a lifelong seafarer, and tragically he was the only man to survive on that ship. There was the loss of the entire crew. There was the loss of the single passenger, a woman, Christina Kavanagh, and Captain Tyrrell survived and would go back to sea for Ted Castles in the years to come. The SS Adela sailed the Liverpool-Dublin route for its entire life, and tragically it entered the history books on the 27th of December 1917 when it was sunk by a German U-boat. But in some ways it was already in the history books by an incident in 1910. The history books record the first ever flight from Britain to Ireland took place in 1910. In fact, the first ever flight from Britain to Ireland fell short by 200 yards when the plane ended up in the sea. The pilot managed to get out, and it was actually the SS Adela that came to the rescue and would pull the plane largely undamaged out of the water on that occasion. So while of course we have to remember the tragic end and the people who died on the SS Adela, it is also worth noting that it gave many years of service to the cities of Dublin and Liverpool, and of course also had its moment in history. The important question is why Irish ships were being sunk by German U-boats. We have to remember that during the First World War, the Great War, the war to end all wars, whichever way we want to call it, that Ireland was under British rule. So when on the 4th of August 1914, when Britain declared war on Germany, Ireland was automatically involved in that war. Britain was very well known for its naval superiority, and one of the first acts of the war was to declare a naval blockade on German ports to restrict the German fleet. The Germans responded in kind and announced a blockade of Britain, which essentially meant the islands of Great Britain and Ireland. In February of 1915, Germany declared that any shipping within the coastal waters of Britain and Ireland were legitimate targets of war. And the phrase they used was that they considered these waters within the seat of war, and that they had the right to sink anything without warning. This policy was restricted after the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania was on its way from New York. It was passing quite near Cork and was sunk with a massive loss of life, and it almost brought the Americans into World War I. Germany, of course, didn't want this to happen, and they restricted the use of this policy of unrestricted warfare, of sinking ships without warning. However, as the war dragged on, in 1917, Germany thought they might be able to end the war quickly with a short, sharp shock to Britain, starve Britain in submission, and resume this policy. And it was in this context that ships like the first of the Guinness Fleet, the W.M. Barclay, the SS Hare, and of course the SS Adela would be lost, with the loss of so many lives.